Ever wondered how children really learn in their early years? What sparks their curiosity and what engages them? Foundational years are not just about learning letters and numbers. They are the building blocks for all future learning. For over a decade, Language and Learning Foundation has worked to strengthen foundational learning through effective classroom practices and system strengthening initiatives. Drawing on this experience, we bring to you LLF Speaks Season 2, a 10-episode podcast series where we engage with global and national voices to explore crucial subjects, contributing to improving FLN outcomes. Stay tuned to deep dive on how to do FLN, conversations on building foundational learning at scale.
Welcome to LLF Speaks Season 2. In this session, we have been exploring a central questions. How do we ensure that every child achieves foundational literacy and numeracy? Across episode, we have spoken about pedagogy, system reform and implementation. However, there is a central piece that often determines whether these efforts succeed or fail. That is how we measure impact. Because what we choose to measure and how we interpret it often shapes what system prioritize, how teacher teach, and ultimately what children learn. Today we are asking, are we measuring what matters? And more importantly, are we using that in order to improve teaching practices which ultimately improves learning outcomes? To explore this, I am joined by Pranav Kothari. Pranav is a key leader at EI, an organization has been which played a pioneering role in student assessment and learning research in India. Over the past 2 decades, EI has worked extensively with state government and education system to make large-scale assessment which go beyond testing and provide deep insights into how children learn. Pranav has been actively involved in designing assessment framework, working with the government to use data more meaningfully to improve classroom practices at scale. Pranav, welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Zahid, and I'm great to be here, and kudos to LLF for doing such fabulous work in FLN.
Okay, what do you understand by measuring impact and how does it differ in FLN context?
Yeah, I think, impact measurement has gained quite the traction, and I'm very happy that it has, because sometimes there's so much focus on kya kiya, what has been done, and there's always sometimes logic that feels the right thing to do, but it may or may not have the impact on, let's say, improving student learning outcomes. Like the classic ones are like increasing teacher pay or teacher training, and many of these logically sound right. So what impact measurement does is our inputs actually leading to student learning outcomes getting better. So a lot of impact measurement needs to first think about what is the intended outcome of a particular intervention, and then what is the best form of a test, of a tool that would capture that. There's been historically more work done in assessing students who are older, right? So you know of the 10th and the 12th standard board exams. Most recently, I think Parak and Safal are thinking about grades 3, 5, 8. But FLN, which means children, roughly between the age of 5 to 7, is a very different ballgame. What we see is like normally if you're doing grades 3 and above, it's a standardized test. It's printed on paper. Children mark it on paper. Either they mark the choice or they bubble it in as part of multiple choice questions. But you can't do that to a 5-year-old. First and foremost, you have to create a fear-free environment where the child is not just so scared seeing a stranger that they're not able to showcase their full potential on the test. So these tests, it's very imperative that whoever is going to conduct the test sort of creates that environment. Secondly, this has to be done one-on-one. You kind of need to engage with the child and encourage them to answer the question, which could be reading out a letter, a word, a passage, or doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, many of these things, and sort of seeing how the child has done that. And that can't be done en masse in a class. So that is one. And so the type of talent that you need to send to conduct an FLN assessment has to be someone with that skills of creating a fear-free environment and also listening intently and observing what the child is doing. So yeah, I think FLN assessments is a much more involved thing. In some ways, it's much more expensive and extensive compared to testing a 10 standard student.
Yeah, basically you have rightly pointed out that FLN assessment basically captures not only the processes but also the ultimate outcome which we generally see in terms of oral reading fluency. Moving on to that, as you have pointed out that these assessment, the FLN assessment should have taken care of both the outcomes, which is the intermediate outcome, that is the change in the teaching learning practices, and also the ultimate outcome, which is the student learning outcomes. So we would like to just unfold the second one, that is the student learning outcome, a bit more by asking a very intuitive questions. What are the different ways in which student learning outcome are being measured in FLN context?
Yeah, I think super important, and a lot of the design of the assessment, like हमको क्या करना है, is a function of हमको क्या जानना है, right? So it should actually design from the end goal of what do we want to know and reverse engineer the testing tool towards that. And that's sort of the first most important thing, is design of the questionnaire, of the tool, of the assessment. Because if you ask the right question, do you get the insight that you want? So let's say we have seen that children are able to correctly say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But then if you ask them, is 5 bigger than 3? They're not able to answer, right? So if, depending on what question you ask, you might come to the conclusion that children know numbers or children don't. And so I think the design of the assessment is quite underrated, because people feel, isme badi baat kya hai? Like, tool hi to banana hai, question hi to bolna hai. But I think that if you don't have the right set of questions, you are going to get garbage data, right? Garbage in, garbage out in some ways. Now, the way it's done on the ground manifests in multiple ways. And again, that is stemming from purpose. Like, so a lot of people say कि सब बच्चों को टेस्ट करना चाहिए, census करना चाहिए, because unless we have data on every child, how will we know how to improve? How will the teacher believe in that? Now, what we have found is that it's really hard to do this with high quality at scale, because it's just intense. It's an expensive process. And to the extent that you actually need student data of each and every student, which is very, very rare, you may want to consider a sample-based assessment, right? When people think that, every child is different, right? But most interventions are designed at the state level or at the district level, at best at a block level. They're not designed at the student level in FLN. So it's perfectly okay to do a representative sample of the population, which actually increases both the quality, because you will do it better, as well as sort of be representative of that. And so what I say, it's possible to do a loose census or a tight sample. And both can have benefits, So like if you think about Gujarat Gunotsav in the mid-2010s, they did census. What it did was it focused a spotlight on learning outcomes. Because it was testing every student and every teacher was involved and every class 1 and 2 officer was involved, suddenly सबको पता चला कि learning outcome important है. Because it could have been focused on infrastructure and toilets and classrooms and electricity and water and many of those things which are inputs to that. So loose census can also have benefits. A tight sample has very useful inputs into the curriculum design team, the textbook team, the SCRT, the academic officer, many of those things that can derive benefit from that. So that's how I think about, the different ways of assessments. And it's very important to know to what end will you use the result that influences both the tool design as well as to whom you administer this test.
Just moving further in this context, we need to focus more on also of different type of assessment which is generally being practiced in FLN context, like for example large scale assessment which we have seen like NASA, ASAR, NICE, Parak, or some state is doing the census based assessment. Similarly, the second assessment is the program based impact assessment, and third one is the formative assessment which is generally that being used by
Yeah.
the teacher extensively, and fourth one is the diagnostic kind of assessment in which we got to know the where we need to focus more in order to improve the teaching learning practices. So can you shed a light on these different type of assessment?
Sure. Yeah. So I think most people are familiar with ASA. It's a nationwide study where they go out and test students, and it's representative at the district level. And I think the success of ASA has been doing it repeatedly, releasing results at the same time every year for more than a decade, and it has really driven home the point that India's learning outcomes are much lower than what they should be. Right. I think what the NAS has done is it's gotten states to have a positive competitive spirit so that they show up on rankings. The types of assessments that EI has done along with LLF interventions is to actually understand what are some pedagogic insights from the teaching learning processes that can be helpful to improve. So, for example, very common practice in Indian classrooms for teachers to say "ka se kabutar, pa se patang," and so on and so forth, and get children to sort of recite that. And what we found is that like when I say "ka se kabutar," like I'm understanding that "ka" is an akshar, and "kabutar" starts with "ka" as the akshar, right? But the child is just memorized this as a poem or a line, like "ka se kabutar." So it's very hard for the child to understand "ka se kahani" and associate it the same way. Okay, "ka" as a letter, "kahani" starts with the same thing. So that's one insight that has come in, and how do you change teaching learning towards making that happen? Another method is that how frequently are you doing this and flowing this back to the teacher? So the word formative assessments, the purpose is that you do this frequently in a way that flows back to the teacher in terms of what he or she can teach differently tomorrow. But if you go and tell a teacher, okay, आपके बच्चे जब 40 minus 28 करते हैं तो वो आंसर में 28 लिख रहे हैं 12 के बदले. So 40 minus 28 is 12. But let's say students are writing 28. Why 28? Because when they see 40 minus 28, they are doing 8 minus 0 instead of doing 10 minus 8 and, borrowing 1 from 4. So they're writing 8 in the units place. And then they're doing 4 minus 2 and they're writing 28. Right? So this is a level of insight that if you tell the teacher can do something differently about that tomorrow. They can actually gather the students who have this misconception and do it. So the more granular, the more diagnostic that you're able to do, the more patterns that you're able to identify, the more you're able to convert this into a teacher remediation plan, the greater the impact on learning outcomes it will come from the assessment. So what will improve is essentially drawing out this. कि भाई संयुक्त अक्षर में प्यारा आधा प is a challenge area for children to read. So संयुक्त अक्षर सिखाओ. या knowing कि भाई जब वो चंद्रमा बिंदु आता है, like how should a child teach, and that's what they're struggling with. So I think insights at that granular level that can come from FLN assessments is, I think, the greatest research discovery that will then, once communicated to teachers along with how they can teach to remove that, will be the best use of this assessments at large scale. So assessments at large scale तो कर सकते हैं, वो मैकेनिक्स इंडिया ने सीख लिया, वो मेमोरी मसल बिल्ड कर लिया है, पर आई थिंक उसमें से क्या निकलता है और उसको कैसे इस्तेमाल करना है इज द नेक्स्ट थिंग ऑन दिस, लेट्स से आई कॉल इट एज द साइंस ऑफ लर्निंग दैट इंडिया हैज टू डिस्कवर एंड डू.
So that's, you have rightly put it, that every assessment should fit for purpose. Assessment and importance of continuous monitoring, what we have rightly pointed out in terms of formative assessment, is really important for the teachers to make the informed decision, because through formative assessment, teacher being able to know like which child at which level, let's suppose for example you are rightly pointed out in terms of the subtraction questions, whether the children has actually understand the concept of place value or not, and if the place value concept has to be taught to the student, then how to make a two group and do the structured remediation daily, that is based on the formative assessments. Now just moving on to this, because this brings us to an important topic of discussion. As we have seen from last few years that many states are heavily relying on the large scale assessment, which is generally done at a end line, which we call as a inline assessment at the end of the program or the end of the academic years. How do you see the balance between large scale assessment and classroom level assessments? Because is there any trade off, or there is a fear that this large scale assessment will fade out the importance of classroom based assessments?
Large scale assessment or classroom assessment both can add value or both can destroy value depending on how you do it and with what attitude. Large scale assessment, agar aap genuinely karte hain and you create even, let's say, a message from the minister and from the senior most secretary and, you know, the department's head and the directors to say कि भाई हमको जांचना है, इसके basis पे we will not take punitive decisions and it will not affect your employment and it will not get into a blame game. Then I think what it does well is it really communicates to everybody that unless we know where we are, how will we get better? It also communicates the importance कि भाई बच्चे को समझ में आना चाहिए. ज़रूरी नहीं है सिर्फ कि टीचर ने सिखा दिया. Delivery is not absorption. So is that happening? So I think there is tremendous value of doing large-scale assessments when done well. It also increases the sensitization amongst multiple people to sort of focus on the child and the learning as opposed to, let's say, a bunch of input data on compliance, right? But what I've also sometimes seen is states do this at large mass. They ask teachers to do data entry. You know, the teachers also know कि ये data तो भरना है, पर इसको कौन देखेगा, इसका क्या होगा, कोई फायदा नहीं होगा. And that's just a sheer waste of time, energy, money, paper, trees, you know, everyone. Because that time could have been spent on learning and teaching. That money could have been spent on improved teacher learning materials. High stakes, large scale assessments is just creating fear. I think what is helpful to know is what is the highest occurring sort of misconception. What do the majority of the students struggle with? And what can I do to do it differently? But I go and tell them कि देखो, you know, जब बच्चा ने 1/4 और 2/3 को ऐड किया तो उसने न्यूमरेटर को ऐड कर दिया 3 और डिनोमिनेटर को ऐड कर दिया 7. तो जब आप पढ़ाओगे तो इसको अलग से पढ़ा सकते हैं. And that is the level of insight that the teachers crave for. Then they are willing to listen to you. That form of micro-dose teacher training is actually going to create that aha moment for the teacher to do. Right? So the asking of the question, what analysis you do, what results you decide, and what you change is literally the make and break. So census large-scale assessments good? It can be good. It's classroom-based assessment. It can be good. But both of them can also be bad if done poorly. So I think it's more in the mechanics of how you do, with what spirit, with what levels of seriousness that literally makes the difference between these.
So, as you have rightly, I think, mentioning when you are saying that when these large-scale assessments become a high stakes for the accountability and governance, do you feel like it creates a fear of having some data reliability issues when the teachers has to, what we can say, so that their school has improving or children are improving, because there might be the accountability through the data governance?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And there's a lot of evidence of that. I think the most rigorous research on this is done by Professor Kartik Muridhar and Abhijit Singh through a JPAL in the state of Madhya Pradesh, where basically they looked at test scores and then they actually went back to the same students with the same test and found a big difference between what was reported earlier versus what was reported now. So fear, pressure will lead to inflation in the results. I mean, I'm not a believer in this stick approach. I'm not a believer in this danda maar ke kaam kara. I'm not a believer in this कि भाई ये target होना ही चाहिए, निपुण बन ही जाना चाहिए, and then, you know, just literally wanting to see only good results. That doesn't help. I think some of the work that, you know, I remember Samagra did in Haryana in a way was like कि भाई oaths लो कि result जो भी है वो सही होना चाहिए, ऊपर हो या नीचे doesn't matter. Right? Take an oath that the result is accurate. It doesn't matter if the result is good or bad. I think it's a much better philosophy that has to be imbibed. But I think people are under too much pressure. There's too little runway. It's too little time. Everything must magically turn overnight. And maybe you can do that something like building toilets and Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, because technically there's a way to clean up the thing. But I think learning and increasing learning outcome is a much harder, much slower, large systemic reform. And one has to have the patience along with a roadmap towards achieving. So we must celebrate progress, which is year-on-year delta, which is year-on-year improvement, rather than saying everybody should like jump over this high bar tomorrow, which I think is not possible.
Yeah, definitely. I think you have rightly pointed out that governance should trust the support instead of creating fear of failures.
Yeah.
because only then we will have reliable data, and that is really important for making a meaningful change, meaningful impact. I'm worrying about when and how this data is become available with the teachers in order to make the real time improvement in the teaching learning practices, because ultimately that is going to have sustainable impact on learning outcomes. So I think we have already discussed about the different nuances of FLN assessments, and that brings us to perhaps most critical aspect: what are the best possible way to measure teaching and learning practices, because if that is the central of our ultimate outcome, which is the learning outcomes.
Bilkul. Of course, I think there is very important role that teachers are playing. We have to also acknowledge it's a very difficult job that they are doing, standing in front of 30, 40, sometimes 70, 80 students who may be coming from the same village, same community, same caste, same socio-economic, but still have very different learning styles and are at very different learning levels. To be able to teach is a very difficult job. Much more difficult than a doctor who's seeing patients one-on-one, right? So I think let's acknowledge that. And therein is built in the empathy and what support can we give to the teacher. So observing teachers in classroom with a heart full and a mindset of helping the teacher and giving them feedback on what they can do differently would be helpful. And if you do this with empathy, the teachers will be willing to listen. I feel every individual wants to get better. So I think the role of classroom practices with this view, and there are lots of tools over the years that have been standardized. The World Bank uses Stallings, and there are ways that you can do this well. I think it's important, and I think with AI now you can actually literally put a video camera and get AI to also give feedback to the teacher. And I say this because the cost and the speed at which the teacher would get feedback would be much faster and cheaper than sending, let's say, trained evaluators. You can always do a sample based of the trained evaluators in this. I think helping the teacher, give them standardized tools of what they can do with their students, right? And then how to quickly calculate the results and draw insights from that could be also very helpful. So I just think about कि इतना difficult job में हम टीचर को बता सके कि भाई हर बच्चे को क्या आता है, ग्रुप को क्या नहीं आता है, आपको कल क्या सिखाना है, और प्रोवन मेथड्स क्या है कि ये सिखाओगे तो बच्चों को समझ में आ जाएगा. Or even let's say in the LLF context we did this analysis, right? कि टीचर कितना बोल रहा है, कर रहा है, ग्रुप के साथ कितना कर रहा है और बच्चे कितना कर रहे हैं. The I do, we do, you do, as it's also called, is something that sometimes good intentioned teachers don't know. Good teachers think, oh, my job is to teach, which means to lecture. They don't realize that good teaching can also be that the kids are doing all the work and you are just observing.
You are just observing.
That's not intuitive, na? Because like sometimes human agency feels like मैं काम नहीं करूँगा तो काम कैसे होगा? But how do you sort of focus on teachers teaching is one thing, students learning is another, and the two are not perfectly correlated. Just because you have delivered a fantastic lesson plan, you are the best trained teacher in the world, well-intentioned and comfortable with the pay, doesn't mean कि वो बच्चे को समझ में आ गया. So I think if we just go with that positive mindset, we help the teacher see some of this is just blind spots. They're not bad intentions. And I think that's what some of these assessments, observations, many of these things can be very helpful to the teacher in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think LLF adds value here, like you have rightly pointed out. We have been using the structured classroom observation tool for just giving the teacher feedback and demonstration whenever required, because our intention is not just to create a tool for monitoring, but for a tool which supports for mentoring. A recent national level study convened by LLF with support of Tata Trust, that is the teaching and learning practices, which captures the teaching learning practices in 1050 schools across the country. I think that report can be a pioneering tool for the policy and also implementation in terms of classroom, because that captures the time and task, lesson sequence, and I do, we do very extensively for the FLN grade teachings.
Yeah, I mean, I love the work that LLF does is because, it's working on things that are also more sustainable after LLF leaves, right? So I think you're working on structured pedagogy, which means really supporting the teachers with lesson plans that are proven to be effective, basis almost a decade worth of research that you have done. And because the teacher, it's simplified and it's viewed as support and not monitoring, the chances that the teacher will use it even after you go away is very high. Second is the fact that you are working with not just the teacher but also the principal, the block level officials, the district officials, the academic officers. Is that you're working with all the system stakeholders, right? And so everybody is rowing in the same direction. It's like one of those Kerala boat races, right? Like it all is very synchronous, and it wouldn't go straight and fast if it was only there.
Yeah. And I think lastly, there is one aspect of impact assessment that is often gets overlooked. That when we talked about impact, we often focus on average scores. But are we missing something important, which is called learning disparities? Because we have seen from Asar, Parakh, and everywhere this learning disparity exists across a school and within a school also. So, what is your point of view on these aspects?
Let's say statistics or analysis has a bunch of parameters. There's mean, there's median, there's mode. हमने स्कूल में भी पढ़ा था. There is standard deviation. There is what's at the end of the bell curve on both sides, and I think each of them is telling you something. So I don't see this as an either or. I see this as an and. Right. So I think the mean is telling you something, which is it is sort of telling you where the average child is. And when it comes to looking at year-on-year improvement in scores, I think the delta and mean is a very important metric of how much the bell curve has shifted. But the mean does not perhaps tell you how much the brightest kid is bright or the weakest kid needs support, right? And so you can sort of look at what is 3 standard deviations away or what's the top 5%. And I'm thinking of a 5th standard child who doesn't even know Akshar recognition, because the average is saying that he's able to read grade 2 text, then we will also lose that kid. Now it almost seems like a gargantuan task to be able to cater to all of this spectrum, but in modern ways, let's say, in a way Maria Montessori discovered this and put people in smaller groups and got them to do it. That's one way. And I think something like a personalized adaptive learning software can do this in even better way to get children to do it. So it is possible to get every child to be on the steep slope of the learning curve. मैं ये नहीं बोल रहा हूँ या कोई भी country ऐसा नहीं है कि वो bell curve ही collapse हो गया, where all kids are at the same level. But I think there are countries where the bell curve has shifted a lot, which means the mean has gone up, the average has gone up, standard, everything has sort of gone. And some in the best countries of the world, like Finland, the bell curve has become narrower, which means, stunningly, Finland ends up being at the top of PISA, which everybody knows. What people don't know is that the difference in scores between any 2 zip codes in Finland is like less than 5% or something. So it's quality and equity. It's excellence and equity. It's not like just the brightest kids of Finland are very bright. It's literally like, the whole system. So I think that's the way to look at these things.
LLF used to believe on these principles of equity. Like, for example, principally we used to visit B and C grade schools for making the improvement in these schools, and especially focusing on not only the average kids but also the kids who are learning the least in the learning ladders. So the best impact measurement should have considered the at least analysis of these equity perspectives in order to ensure that the assessment looks very inclusive, because the ultimate goal is not only improving the averages but also mitigating the differences, which is either at a inter-school level or the between school level. What we have found, I think, in our assessments also from last 2-3 years, that just because of focusing these low bottom learners over the year, the learning disparity between schools and within school both is declining.
Amazing.
However, there is still a substantial learning disparity within school in itself. Like, for example, in most of the cases in UP and Haryana, you will find that some children are learning very high, which the system call them a Nipun, and some students are struggling learner, which we call them a zero reader or the struggling readers. And I think the system already have this system to cater this through the formative assessments and making the 2 groups and do the structure remediation through the daily remediation plan.
Absolutely. In fact, the study that EI did on LLS work has actually found that there was like something like 70% of the students were zero scorers at the baseline, but by end line, that was less than 5%. So, a lot of what you're doing is making a difference in both the top quartile and the bottom quartile.
Bottom quartile. And that is the philosophy of our working also, ki focusing not only the middle, the averages and the top quartile, but moving the needle to the bottom quartile also. So now I think moving on to the last part, which is I think really important in the current context. Like we know that in FLN context, the assessment mostly done by human led. However, nowadays the focus more on the digital assessment. So can you give your opinion for our audience to make a distinction and pros and cons of these two type of assessment, which is generally being used in FLN context?
So, in the context of FLN assessments, which means you're testing children roughly between the age of 5 to 7, we don't normally do pen and paper assessments, which means getting the child to write because, the fine motor skills and for a variety of reasons, they're not taking it. So that leaves us with two options. Historically, a lot of this was human-led, facilitator-led, which meant a very highly skilled and highly trained person who's going there, traveling to the field, creating a fear-free environment for the child, asking them questions, creating the rapport, and then sort of noting down and placing them into buckets and giving some scores or, tags and things of that nature. Now, the good thing about this, it feels very human. Of course, they're able to observe a lot of, let's say, characteristics, latent, body language, many things that, and I think that's quite good. The challenges that researchers have faced over the years on that is sometimes inter-rater reliability, which means, even if two very well-intentioned, very trained people go, their scores can be very different. And then how do you know what's the right thing between the two? And the only way to resolve was to send a third person. And as you can imagine, costs go up really well, right? So I think the costs of doing this are pretty high. I mean, when we've done this, it's about 10 times more than doing an assessment of a fifth grader through a written test to do that. So that becomes very expensive very quickly, not to mention the time. And so I think, EI built this assessment for FLN tool specifically. We call it the Neve product. And the problem that we wanted to solve was many of these. So one is where the child is taking the entire assessment on a tablet. So this is not the evaluator going and filling information on that. That's just data entry. This is actually the bacha. A 6-year-old bacha is holding a tablet and taking a test. Of course, we learned a lot over the years. So we've built it कि familiarity ho, पहले practice questions ho, training ho, many of those things. So there is no handicap because they're taking a digital test. So I think it's amazing to see these 6-year-olds who have just become familiar with touch and swipe and next button. So the beauty of this is that, the fidelity at which this test is done, whether you do it in the slums of Mumbai or you do it in the villages of Jharkhand or you do it like in Dantewada in Chhattisgarh, is the same. The quality of the test is the same because, it scales beautifully. Second is we are able to capture much richer information. So the other thing is like now you have, let's say on a time task, where you are supposed to identify 25 letters in whatever 2 minutes or so. पहले क्या होता था कि भाई हमको पता था कि 2 मिनट में बच्चा ने एवरेज में 17 letters सीख लिया. But now actually I can measure every letter how much seconds it took. So I can tell you कि भाई स तो 3 सेकंड में हो जाता है पर श के लिए 30 seconds लगते हैं because I have that data through the digital thing. The other thing is कि with the GPS signals and everything, you can be pretty sure कि बच्चे ने ही test लिया. You can even take video or you can take photos of the child throughout the test कि भाई teacher ने help नहीं कर दिया, दीदी ने help नहीं कर दिया. So overall we feel the rigor has gone up dramatically on this. There are some cons, of course. I think, just recharging these devices and handling these devices and frankly speaking, cost will come down if you use it. Utilization of the devices is very high, right? Because otherwise it may be expensive also. Some more benefits of doing this digitally is now that you can do this in language of comfort of the child. Auditing is easier. So, sometimes you want to, let's say, the partner organization or a donor or a third party wants to audit the work you've done. We have access to the recordings. We have access to the data. So I think that's a huge benefit that comes in. they can actually get maybe 3 or 4 students to do it. So I think overall cost per child would go down. Cost goes down. You can now test more students, or you can test them more frequently. So you can get data much more faster with digital, literally analysis can be overnight. Many of those sub-scores. So I think is some of the benefits. I think on the disadvantages is just sometimes, technical glitches on the ground then can cause frustration. There's a bit of a learning curve, so it may take longer than doing it in person. But I feel I'm taking a long-term bet on this, that children will get used to it. Both the human-led and the tech-led have pros and cons. There is no one-size-fits-all. But I think it's really opened up a lot, not just for the assessment, but for the research community to know. क्योंकि देखो headline statement बोलना आसान है कि half of grade 5 kids don't know grade 2. पर क्यों? कहाँ issue आ रहा है? That is what we can uncover through that. And I think, organizations like LLF, which are learning organizations, like you guys are not married to what you did 5 years ago. You keep innovating, you keep researching, you keep doing things differently. So for you, the amount of feedback loop that is going to come in because of digital assessments might be very good. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, and I think you have rightly pointed out that in LLF, we are actually using the mix of both, like human-led assessment, but through the audio audit and audio recordings. And that audio recording, what we have used not for only correction in the assessment, but the assessment methodology itself. And based on the input which is coming from these audio audits, we have make guidelines for the enumerator to do the FLN grade assessments. And that's really helping us. So thank you, Pranav. As we have discussed today, measuring impact is not just about collecting data, but it is about to understanding what the data tells us and how to use that data in order to make informed decision for changing the classroom teaching practices, which sustainably improves the learning outcomes. If FLN is a goal, then meaningful measurement becomes a bridge between intent and impact. Pranav, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today.
Thank you, Zahid. Thank you, Zahid. It was a great conversation. I'm so glad that you and many others are giving impact evaluations or FLN assessments the attention it deserves. So often we are focused on doing the intervention and thinking that it must yield the right results. But I think impact evaluations keep us honest. I think FLN assessments is an emerging field. It has not been very long since we have started testing young children. And the fact that, we are also learning a lot and adapting to what is most useful to practitioners like you and to government officers is something that we're learning every day. I think I'm pretty excited about this field. I'm glad that India and many other countries are focusing on first things first, which is literally getting every grade 3 child to be grade 3 equivalent. I think it sounds simple, but it's a big, important goal, because then we set the foundations right. And I hope that impact evaluations get seen as an ally in that journey, and not as a villain who comes and tells कि आपने अच्छा काम नहीं किया. I think the intention is to be a mirror. The intention is to be non-judgmental. The intention is to be a thought partner towards doing this. So we are very grateful for the partnership, and it's been great to see LLF from the sidelines and see the amazing impact of your work in UP, Haryana, many other states. So kudos and keep up the good work.
Thank you for the good words. And to our listeners, thank you so much for being with us. And we will see you in next episode of LLF Speaks.